This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with a qualified professional before making any investment decisions.
Welcome to the Wire Weekly Roundup. The week in real estate presented in digestible bites. Hold on while our AI hosts take us on another ride through this week's top real estate headlines.
Welcome back to The Wire, everyone. For those of you joining us today, get ready for a deep dive into some of the latest buzz in real estate.
Yeah, some hot topics.
Yeah, we've got a really interesting stack of information to unpack this time around.
It's a good one.
So consider this your shortcut to staying informed.
Cliff Notes.
Yeah, exactly. Cliff Notes.
I like it.
So we've got recent data from the National Association of Realtors. That's
Right.
NAR, for those of you in the know.
Of course.
And then we've got this fascinating look at off-MLS sales, courtesy of Zillow.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and the National Association of Home Builders, or NAHB, is weighing in with their take on how mortgage rates are impacting things.
Big topic.
Yeah, huge.
Yeah.
And then Redfin is looking ahead, gazing into their crystal ball to tell us what they think are going to be the hottest neighborhoods in 2025.
Always interesting to see where they land.
Yeah, and then we'll round it out with the freshest weekly pending home sales numbers from Housing Wire. Oh, and we'll touch on what some folks are predicting for interest rates as well.
Can't forget about interest rates.
No, never. Keep an eye on them. So our mission today is to try and, make sense of all of these different angles, try and spot the real trends in the market and really figure out what it all means for you and how you understand today's real estate scene.
Yeah, I mean, are we seeing a consistent picture or is everyone telling a different story?
Right, exactly. Are we getting the same story from every source, or, are there conflicting viewpoints that we need to unpack?
Yeah. And what does that mean for our listeners? How do they make sense of it all?
Right. Yeah.
What are the actionable takeaways?
Exactly. Actionable takeaways. That's what we're all about here on The Wire.
That's the name of the game.
All right, so let's unpack this, shall we?
Let's do it.
So, one thing that really jumped out at me was this theme of, market activity levels.
Okay. Activity levels we're picking.
Yeah, and it's coming up in a couple of different reports that we looked at.
Right.
And Housing Wire's report on the weekly pending home sales really stood out to me.
Yeah, I saw that one too.
They're saying that new contracts for single-family homes have jumped up 4% just from the previous week.
Wow. That's a pretty decent jump.
Yeah, pretty substantial.
Especially week over week.
And even more than that, they're 2.3% higher than the same week last year.
So we're exceeding last year's numbers.
Yeah, and even running ahead of where we were in early 2024.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and then on top of that, they noted 14,000 new condo sales as well.
Okay, so it's not just single-family homes. Condos are seeing some action too.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So it feels like, after this period of hesitation that we've seen in the market, there's this surge of buyers finally sort of dipping their toes back in.
Yeah, like they were waiting for the right moment and now they're ready to jump in.
Yeah. What do you think about this uptick in activity?
I think it's definitely a positive sign. Points towards some momentum building in the market. It does seem to suggest that buyers who were sitting on the fence, waiting to see what would happen.
Yeah.
They're feeling a little bit more confident now.
Okay.
Especially when you consider the year-over-year increase.
Yeah.
We're doing better than we were last year at this time.
Right.
But, it's super important to remember that sales volume is just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Okay, so what are we missing?
Well, we need to look at how this activity is translating to prices.
Okay, prices, yeah, because that's really the bottom line for a lot of folks.
Exactly.
And that's where things get a little bit more nuanced, I guess.
Okay, how so?
So while we are seeing this increase in activity on the sales front, the Housing Wire Altos data is painting a slightly different picture when we look at what sellers are asking for their properties.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the median asking price for all active listings is only up by a very tiny 0.2% compared to this time last year.
So barely any movement.
Yeah. So it's this really minimal year-over-year increase in asking prices.
It seems like the market's still trying to find its footing, after all the volatility we've seen.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if sellers are kind of aware of the affordability challenges that buyers are facing and they're not being too aggressive with those price increases?
Right. I mean, if they price too high, they might not get any bites.
Exactly.
Buyers just aren't going to go for it.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really interesting for, our listeners out there.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So the fact that those asking prices aren't seeing a significant jump, even with more sales happening, that suggests a certain level of price sensitivity in the market.
Okay, so buyers are being more cautious.
Yeah, they might be more willing to jump in now than they were a few months ago, but maybe not at just any price.
They're being a little bit more strategic.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And, this kind of connects to another data point that Housing Wire brought up. The percentage of homes with price reductions has actually gone up to 34.3%.
Oh, wow. So sellers are having to lower their asking prices.
Yeah, and they point out that this is higher than what we usually see at this point in the year,
Mm.
although it's nowhere near the levels we saw back in 2022 when things were really shifting.
Right, right.
But it does feel like sellers are starting to adjust their expectations. They're trying to meet the current market conditions, even with that uptick in sales.
So what do you make of that?
Well, I think that rise in price reductions is a key indicator for our listeners to watch.
Okay, tell me more.
It suggests that while there might be more buyers out there, the supply of homes is still giving those buyers a little bit of leverage.
So it's not quite a seller's market yet?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
It seems like sellers might be testing the waters with higher prices initially, but then they have to come down a bit to meet buyer expectations and actually close the deal.
So it's a little bit of a dance happening.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this whole issue of affordability is really front and center right now.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And the NAHB data really throws a spotlight on why that is.
Okay, fill us in.
So their analysis showed that even just a small dip in the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate, just 0.62%, going from that peak of 7.62% down to 7%,
Yeah.
that actually made a median-priced home affordable for an additional 2.8 million households.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
Yeah, it really underscores how sensitive buyer activity is to those interest rate fluctuations.
So even a small change can make a big difference.
Absolutely. Even a fraction or percent can have a huge impact on potential homeowners.
Wow. Okay, so those interest rates are really something to keep an eye on.
Definitely. And, for those of you in the industry, it highlights how closely you need to be tracking those rate changes and understanding how they might affect buyer demand.
Okay, so any movement in those rates could really shake things up.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that Zillow's report brings to the table.
All right. What's Zillow got for us?
This is a really compelling and frankly quite concerning issue.
Oh, I don't like the sound of that.
It's about the financial implications of selling homes off the multiple listing service, or MLS.
Okay, off MLS sales. Interesting.
Yeah. So their study found that sellers who went the off MLS route in the last couple of years, they actually lost over $1 billion in sale proceeds nationwide.
Wow, that's a huge number.
Yeah, and on average, that's about $5,000 less per sale.
Ouch.
Yeah, a 1.5% difference compared to homes that were listed on the MLS.
Okay, this is a real financial hit.
But here's where it gets really interesting and deeply troubling.
Okay, I'm all ears.
These losses were significantly higher in communities of color.
Wow, really?
Yeah, so on average, they were losing 3.2% less than MLS-listed properties. In majority Black neighborhoods, the median loss was almost $10,000.
That's significant.
Yeah, and in majority Hispanic neighborhoods, it was almost $14,000.
Yeah, that's a huge disparity.
It is. It's really alarming.
Yeah.
And it really raises this important question about, fairness and transparency in the market.
Absolutely. I mean, this data suggests that the way you choose to sell your home, whether it's broadly exposed on the MLS or, kept in a more private network, that can have a substantial financial impact.
Right.
And it's alarming that this impact is disproportionately felt in communities of color.
Exactly. And the Zillow data goes even further.
Oh, there's more.
Yeah. They found that Hispanic and Black home sellers are far more frequently advised by their agents to use private listing networks.
Really?
Yeah. Almost 75% of them reported getting that recommendation compared to only 24% of white sellers.
Wow, that's a massive difference in the advice being given.
It is. And it makes you wonder, is it a lack of awareness about the potential downsides of going off MLS? Or are there other factors at play that might be limiting, equitable access to that broader market exposure?
It's a really important question for anyone involved in the real estate market to consider.
Right. And all of this ties directly into the National Association of Realtors Clear Cooperation Policy.
Okay, remind us what that is again.
So this policy is aimed at ensuring fair access to listings. and it requires agents to list properties on the public MLS within 24 hours of marketing them privately.
Okay, so it's about making sure everything's out in the open.
Right, exactly. And Zillow is a big advocate for this policy, emphasizing the importance of broad exposure and transparency for all sellers.
Makes sense.
And it's worth noting that NIR is actually expected to vote on a potential repeal of this policy soon.
Oh, wow. So this could all change.
Yeah, it could. And this upcoming vote is really sparking debate about, balancing that open access with seller flexibility.
Yeah, I can see both sides of that argument.
Right.
It's a tough one.
It is. And it could have, significant ramifications for how properties are marketed and sold in the future.
Definitely something to keep an eye on.
Absolutely.
So what else did we learn from our deep dive this week?
Well, let's take a look at what Redfin has to say about the hottest neighborhoods for 2025.
Okay. Always love a good list.
Yeah. And their rankings are based on, year-over-year growth in listing views and their compete score.
Right. So they're looking at how much interest these neighborhoods are generating.
Exactly. And a couple of interesting trends popped up.
Okay.
I'm curious. So first of all, a significant number of the hottest neighborhoods are actually in Midwest suburbs.
Interesting. So it's not all about the coasts anymore.
Right, exactly.
So which suburbs are we talking about?
Well, places like Jenison, Michigan,
Okay.
Campton Hill, St. Charles, Illinois,
Hmm.
and Fairport, New York.
Okay, got it.
And it seems like these areas are attracting buyers who are seeking affordability,
Makes sense.
but they also want to maintain, a reasonable commute to the downtown.
So they're not completely giving up on city life.
Right,
It's
exactly.
about finding that balance.
Yeah, that's sweet spot.
Okay, so if you're looking for more budget-friendly options, but you still want to have access to the city, these might be some areas to watch.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
But it's not just about the suburbs.
Oh, there's more.
Yeah, Redfin also highlights this resurgence in demand in some major coastal cities.
Okay.
So New York City specifically, Brooklyn's Prospect Heights, Clinton Hill, and Staten Island's Great Kills,
Cool.
and San Francisco's Polk, Gultrushan Hill, those are all seeing increased interest.
Wow, so those urban cores are making a comeback.
It seems that way, and Redfin agents are attributing this to workers returning to the office after the pandemic.
Okay, so that makes sense. People want to be closer to their jobs again.
Right, and the numbers in Brooklyn are particularly striking.
Really? How so?
Home sales there have spiked by a whopping 105% year over year.
Wow, that's a huge jump.
It is, and it's interesting to note that in these more expensive markets, interest from foreign buyers and cash offers remains strong.
So they're less affected by those mortgage rate fluctuations we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
So they're kind of in their own little bubble.
Yeah, in a way.
Interesting.
So we've looked at sales activity, pricing those off MLS concerns, and those emerging hot neighborhoods.
It's a lot to digest.
It is, but there's one more thing.
Okay, lay on me.
This was a rather surprising insight that emerged when we looked at the Housing Wire data as a whole.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So we're seeing this uptick in overall pending sales, right?
Right.
But home price appreciation is really limited, and we've got that rising share of price reductions. So it seems like increased activity isn't necessarily translating to higher prices.
Okay, that is surprising.
Yeah, and Housing Wire's analysis even raises the possibility of national home prices declining for the entire year of 2025.
Wow, even with higher sales volume.
Yeah, and they point out that hasn't happened since 2010.
So what does this all mean for our listeners?
It signals a potential shift in negotiating power.
Okay.
And it underscores how critical it is to really understand the specific conditions in your local market.
So don't just rely on national trends. You need to know what's happening in your own backyard.
Exactly.
Okay, so that potential disconnect between increased sales volume and possibly declining national home prices, that's a nuanced but crucial takeaway. It tells us that market activity alone isn't always a reliable indicator of price growth.
Right.
You've got to look at things like affordability constraints and inventory levels.
Right, all those factors that can really shape price trends.
Exactly.
So as we wrap things up here, what would you say is the key takeaway for our listeners today? Those real estate enthusiasts and pros who are navigating this market.
Well, it seems like early 2025 is presenting a really mixed bag.
Yeah, a bit of a puzzle.
There's definitely some causative signs out there.
Like what?
Well, we've got increased buyer activity, likely spurred by those little dips in mortgage rates.
Right.
And that's a good sign for sales volume.
Okay.
But then we've also got the muted price appreciation, and in some cases, that potential for downward pressure on prices.
Yeah, it's a bit of a wild card.
It is, and it reminds us that affordability is still a major hurdle for many.
Right.
And then we can't forget about that data on off-MLS sales.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
It raises some really important questions about transparency and equitable practices in the industry.
Things we should all be thinking about.
Absolutely. And then finally, those hottest neighborhoods highlighted by Redfin, they show us that there's this dual trend happening.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, there's the enduring appeal of those big urban centers.
Right.
But at the same time, there's this continued draw to more affordable suburban listener with good commuting options.
So it's all about finding what works best for your individual needs and circumstances.
Exactly.
Okay, so as we navigate this evolving landscape, what's the most important thing for our listeners to keep in mind?
Well, understanding those nuances, the interplay between sales, volume, price trends, and those regional demand drivers, that's going to be crucial for making informed decisions.
So don't just jump into anything without doing your research.
Right, exactly. And this raises an important question for everyone out there.
What's that?
With all these factors at play, what specific strategies are you considering in your own approach to the real estate market right now?
Yeah, that's a great question for everyone to ponder.
Are you adjusting your investment strategies based on these trends?
Right. Are you having different conversations with your clients about pricing and negotiation tactics?
This market requires careful analysis and a tailored approach.
Couldn't agree more.
It's all about adapting to the changing dynamics.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today.
Another one for the books.
We really hope this breakdown of all the latest real estate data has given you some valuable insights to chew on.
Lots to think about.
There is, and the market is clearly in a period of transition right now. So staying informed about those underlying trends is absolutely key.
Knowledge is power.
It really is. So think about those implications of what we discussed regarding off-MLS listings.
Yeah, are those conversations happening in your local real estate circles?
And what are your thoughts on the clear cooperation policy and how it might impact market transparency?
Big questions.
Yeah, and then think about those regional variations in demand.
Are you seeing those same trends that Redfin highlighted reflected in your own market?
And don't forget about that potential divergence between sales volume and price trends.
Definitely something to keep a close eye on as the year progresses.
So we encourage you to, delve deeper into these topics.
Yeah.
Think about how they specifically apply to your own interests and the markets you follow.
Do your homework.
Exactly. Well, thanks so much for joining us on The Wire.
Always a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with another in-depth look at the world of real estate.
Until next time.
See you then. Bye.
If you're interested in your own personalized edition of The Wire, please visit us at thewire.fm/custom. We offer market-specific podcasts with all the latest real estate news and market analysis delivered to you weekly or monthly. Own your market with a personalized edition of The Wire, The Week in Real Estate. Thank you for listening.